In the last video, we had a look at how to create this Kirigami paper mapping inside of Resolume. And now we want to have a look at how to actually create some content for it. In this video, I'm going to focus on Blender, and then I'll have another one for Cinema 4D. But please let me know what program you're using, because I usually use Cinema 4D, and I'm currently just like relearning Blender and how to do the same things that I know from Cinema. But I'm curious how many of you use Blender and how many use Cinema. Now before we start, just one note on file naming. The way I do it is I have my project name. I name this by the year, the month, and then the date, and then whatever the name is. And inside of this project, I create a 01 assets folder for all of my assets that I use for this project. Then I create 02 project folder for the Blender, Cinema 4D, After Effects, all of the project files. And then I create a 03 render folder, which contains all of the image sequences that I render from the 3D programs. So like my Blender image sequences and all of those go into here. And then my final exports go into 04 exports. And this way you can keep everything nice and tidy. So first of all, let's have a look inside of Resolume to see how we can export the input map to bring it into Blender. So first of all, I have all of my slices, and then I also created one full slice. Just if you go here and add a new slice just to cover the entire image. And I just want to have this, once I export it, to have a sort of reference frame. Now once I have all of these slices, I can go up here to the left and go to export to SVG and then select my my project where I want to save it. Now, once I save this, I did encounter some problems when importing the SVG directly into Blender. So I recommend importing it into Illustrator once, exporting it as an SVG from there, and then importing it into Blender. For some reason, it just behaves very differently when you do it that way. And this will ensure that the whole process works. I do also include the SVG template in the preset file that you can get in my web store. So if you got that, you can just get it right off that folder. But if you're working with your own mapping, then I recommend doing this and just taking this into Illustrator once. If you don't have Illustrator, I guess you could try just taking it into some form of alternative software or some converter, like maybe just converting it into an older version of SVG might help. But yeah, I'm just going to take it in here and then click Save SVG and then just override it and yeah, set this to SVG 1.1. So yeah, that's just a quick little excursus into Illustrator, nothing fancy. So now we can actually go inside of Blender and import our input map. Now, usually you would delete this cube. I just want to keep it for now, just as a reference for scale. So I'm just going to move it to the side by pressing G. I'm just going to move it somewhere here and import my SVG under File, Import SVG, and then select my input map. Now that I've imported it, you can see it's really small. This is also why I kept the cube, just to see the size of this. If I select it all, just by click and dragging and press the S key, I can scale it. And now I can type in a number. I'm just going to scale it by 10. And this is going to scale it up for me. Now you can see it's a bit messy, because there's some overlapping. The one slice that is filling the entire screen is kind of overlapping with the rest of the slices. But that doesn't matter too much, it's just for now. So the slice right here is actually the bottom slice for me. And I'm just gonna see if that's the one. Yeah, so that is the one, and I'm just gonna rename this one to full, just so I know that this one is my full image. I just need this for reference and I'm gonna delete it later. But what I'm gonna do now is I can actually get rid of this cube, pressing X. And I'm just gonna select everything by pressing the A key on my keyboard. And now I wanna set my pivot point to the center of this object. And this is why I kept this slice in here, because this is the most important one, because it marks the center of our whole mapping. Now, to set the origin to the center, I'm going to go up here to Object, Set Origin, and then set the origin to Geometry. So now you can see, it's still really messy, but now you can see that all of my origin points are set to the center of the objects. And the most important one is the one of our full slice right here, which marks the center of the entire object. And what we want to do now is parent this one to all of the other objects, so we can center everything to our center. So now I'm going to parent this one by clicking the full slice first, then scrolling down and shift clicking the last slice. So this selects everything. And now I can press Command P, or you can also go to Object right here and say Parent, Parent Object. And now you can see that it collapsed into my full slice right here. So now everything is in there. And now if I set the origin point, and you can set the origin by going to the orange icon here, where you have your location of the object. You can set this to 0, 0. And now I zeroed the whole object out and everything is aligned to my 0 point. Now we can actually delete our plane right here. The problem is if I just delete the plane, my objects all jump back into their previous position. So what I need to do is I'm gonna unfold all of the objects right here, select the full slice and then go back down to select everything again, shift click it. And I'm gonna go to Object Parent and say Clear Parent and Keep Transformation. You can also do this by clicking Option P and say Clear Parents and Keep Transformation. And now when I delete my plane right here, you can see that all of the objects are centered. Now that we have this all centered, we can start aligning our camera. If I go into my default camera right here, you can see that it is in a diagonal position. So what we want to do first is just center all of the transformation. I'm going to go here again to the object properties, and for the location I'm going to set it to 0, 0, 0, and also for the rotation. And now if I move back on the Z-axis, I can see that I am perfectly centered and I have my object here. Now I want to have a different resolution for this one because our input map is actually not a full HD composition as this frame right here, but it's actually narrower. So for this I'm going to go into here into the output properties, and I'm going to set the resolution X to 684 by 1080, and this is our resolution of the input map. While we're here, I'm also going to change the frame rate to 30 FPS and then the frame range to 300 frames. And this way we're going to have a perfect 10 seconds loop. I can also expand that right here to see the end of my timeline. Now I can go back into my object properties for the camera and start to align my output to the object. So I'm going to zoom into here until we are pretty much perfectly aligned to our edges. And the great thing about Blender is that you can just zoom in with the mouse wheel, and with Shift middle mouse button you can move around the image, so I can really get up close here and check that my scene aligns. Yeah, this is pretty good. Yeah, perfect. So now we are perfectly aligned. You could also load in a reference image to check if it's correct by clicking Shift A, going to image reference and importing our mapping template and then scaling this to fit our composition. And now we can see that if I, let me just drag this into my main collection here. So if I make this invisible, I can see that it's perfectly aligned. So I can keep this in here just for reference, but I'm just gonna disable it in viewport and in the render. All right, so now that we have our object in here, we can start animating some of this stuff. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a kind of rotation, like an individual rotation on all of the elements. And this is gonna be a similar technique to what the cloner can do in Cinema 4D. So to do that, I'm gonna add a new cube, put it into my main collection here, and I'm gonna call this cloner. Now I'm gonna jump into the geometry nodes view up here, create a new geometry node setup, and delete my group input, which is the cube. We don't need that. What we do need is the collection of our input map. So you can just take the collection from here, click and drag it into your geometry node setup. Now we have this in here. We can connect this to our output. And to see that this is working, we can disable our input map in the group right here. And we can see that it is still here. And this is now actually our cloner geometry node setup right here. So I'm also going to activate the separate children right here. So we actually have all of the individual objects and can control them. And now I'm going to add a rotate instances node by pressing Shift A, and then I'm going to press the S key to search for the rotate instances. And I'm just going to insert that in here. And when I start dragging the Y rotation here, you can see that all of the objects are rotating. So now we can start animating this by using a noise texture. I'm going to insert this again with Shift A, S to search, noise texture. Insert that here, and I can output my value into the rotation now, but what you can see is that now I'm actually changing all of the axes for the rotation, and I just want to affect one axis. I just want to affect the Y axis. So what I'm going to put in between here now is a combine XYZ node, which allows me to input this value just into one of these values, and the rest is just going to stay at 0. So I'm actually going to drag this onto the Y value here, onto the Y axis. And now I can see that this is already looking way better. To animate the noise, I want to change it to 4D. Now we get this additional value here, the W, which allows me to animate the whole texture. Now I can see when I move this, that not much is happening, and this is because we're basically moving at values between 0 and 1 here, and for the rotation 0 and 1 degrees is very little. So I'm just going to insert a math node just to multiply this by a factor, and I'm going to do that again, Shift A, S to search, math, and then insert this right here. And now I can change this from add to multiply. I can also quickly do that by pressing the M key. And for the value, I'm going to set it to 10 for now. And now I can see that already much more is happening here. So now let's actually animate the noise with keyframes. I am going to open up my timeline for this, and I can do that by going into the bottom left corner until I see this plus icon, and then drag up to open up a new window here. And to the left, I can click this right here to change my view, and I'm going to go into the timeline. So now I have a nice little timeline down here. I will set a keyframe for the W value at 0 here. I can just hover the value and press the I key to set a keyframe. And then I'm gonna scroll to the end or just press here or press Shift and right arrow key. With Shift arrow left and right, you can jump to the first and last frame. Also, before we do this, one important thing, be sure that you have your animation keyframes set to linear mode. Now to do that, you want to head into the Edit Preferences and go to Animation here. And for the F-curve settings, the default interpolation you want to set to linear. And that ensures that all of the keyframes you set are linear, and this is going to be important because what we want to do is create some loops, and in order to have some seamless loops we always want to have a linear animation. So be sure to do that before you actually set the first keyframe. So now let's change the value for the last frame. I'm going to set that to 5. And then press the I key again to set a new keyframe. Now, if I play this back, I can see that we have something going on. It's interesting, but it's also a bit abrupt. So to change that, I'm gonna play around with the parameters here. I think I'm gonna turn down the scaling to something like 1. And now it's already a whole lot smoother. And I'm also probably going to turn down the detail to 0. And the roughness we could also set to 0. And now we have a pretty smooth animation. The only problem is that this doesn't loop. If you're into Blender, you probably know this trick. But what we want to do to loop this is we want to create a second texture. We can duplicate this texture by pressing Shift D. Drag this down here. And we want to have the second texture to have a offset basically. So when the first one goes from 0 to 5, I want to have the second one go from -5 to 0. So for the first frame, I'm going to set this to -5. Press I for the press I to set a keyframe. Press Shift right arrow key to go to the last frame. Set this to 0. Press the I key to set another keyframe. So now you can see that my first frame starts at 0 for the first texture. And then when we come to the end, my second noise right here is at 0. So this is going to be the same value, and we just want to animate in between those two, so have a gradual mix from this one to the second one. And that way we're going to have a seamless loop. So by pressing Shift A and S key to search, I can type mix to create a new mix node. I'm going to drag my two outputs into the A and B channel here. And the result goes into the multiplier, and I don't need this anymore. And so this value I am also going to keyframe now. So I'm going to go to the first frame, Shift left arrow key, set this to factor of 0, I to make a keyframe, go to the last frame, set this to 1, I to create a keyframe. And now when I play this from here, I should have a perfect loop, yes. And we can also make a little variation of this, not to have all of them rotating at once, but to have some of them standing still. And to do that, I'm just gonna make some space here between the mix and the multiply. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna insert a ramp here. So Shift A, S, ramp, color ramp, and insert this right here. And now when I drag my black value up, you can see that this kind of changes the offset of our noise. And so now it only affects certain parts of the whole structure. Now the last thing we want to do before going into some lighting and rendering is to actually add some material to those objects, because right now they have no material applied. And we can do this right inside of the geometry nodes right here. So I'm just gonna look for a material and select the set material node here, insert this, and we're just gonna select this standard white material. So to create a new material, you can also go to the right here to create a new material. I'll call this white, because for now I just want to play with some black and white clips, because black and white is just very good for the especially small projectors, because it's the strongest contrast that you can get. So now we have that applied, we can actually start to go into our lighting and rendering settings. For that, I'm going to switch to the layout view, and I'm just going to work with the light that we already have right here in our scene. I'm just going to set the position to 0. The closer that your light is to the object, the longer and the stronger the shadows will be. So I'm just going to keep it quite low down here and see what we get from this. And to have this view with the lighting, you want to switch into the viewport shading mode right here. So this already basically shows pretty much the final result when you render it out with Evee. I'm going to switch back to my camera view for now. We want to head into some settings right here. Now first let's have a look at the light. So the object properties for the light are right here, and the power is set to 1000 watt, which is quite strong. I'm just gonna set that down to something like 50 for now and see if that's any good. I think that doesn't look too bad. And we also wanna activate the shadows right here, which are already activated. And what is also important is to activate these contact shadows right here. And this is giving us some more shadows of the individual objects that they throw onto each other. And with these contact shadows, sometimes you have some problems with the distance, that they have like a sort of gap between the actual object and the shadow. And to fix that, you just want to you want to play around with the distance value right here. I'm just going to set that to 200. I had good experience with that. And also increase the thickness to something like 200. I don't have any highly technical explanation for this right now. I just had the experience that this fixed some problems that I had in the past. Now we can have a look at our render settings. We are going to stay in the Evee engine because that is the real-time engine and it's just way faster than rendering with cycles. And since what we're doing is quite simple, Evee will be more than enough. When you go into the render settings, the render properties, which is the camera icon right here, you can see that our render engine, as I said, is Evee. And as the first parameter we have right here is the sample settings. So you can already see our render and viewport samples. I'm going to set both of those to something a bit higher, like 200, but nothing too crazy because, again, our scene is quite simple. Now here we can also tweak our shadow settings, which are right here inside of shadows, and you can set the resolution of the shadow maps basically. So the higher you set those, the better the shadow quality will be basically. You should also probably use 32-bit shadows, so tick on high bit depth. Basically in the scene, like all we have is shadows, so we might as well give some focus to those. So actually, I'll just set this up to the highest value possible. Now you can see that right now our background is grayish. What I actually want to do is render out with an alpha channel. So to do that, you want to go into those film settings right here and check on this transparent tick box. And this way you can see that we're now creating an alpha channel and we can render everything out with transparency. So for now, I think this is pretty much it, and we can actually render this out. To do that, we're going to go into the output properties and select our output right here. I'm just going to render that into my project folder, create a new folder, call that rotation, shadows. And accept. I'm going to start the render by clicking render, render animation. Now that my image sequence is rendered, I can drag it into After Effects. So I'm just taking the folder of all of the images, drag it into After Effects, and then right-click it and create a new comp from selection. And this is what it looks like, looking good. And it also has the alpha channel in here, which is perfect. You can also see the seamless loop. So if I jump to the end right here, I can also check if it's looping, and that's looking quite good. So to render this, I am just gonna drag it into my render queue. And once you install Resolume Arena, you also install its native codec, which is the DXV3 codec. And you always want to use that when rendering for Resolume because that processes on the GPU and will save you a lot of resources. And for maximum efficiency, you just always want to use that codec. So to change it, you can go to the output module right here. And the format, you just want to set to DXV3 right here. And here you can also select the RGB plus alpha to render it with the alpha channel. Then select your output. I'm gonna put that into my exports and render it out. And once it's rendered, you can drag it into Resolume and start playing around with it. So now let's have a look at a second technique that we can use to create some mapping loops for this. Now, another way to think about it is that you can divide your object into several smaller parts. And so this is also why I worked with a perfect grid for my template that I created, because that way I can create an array of cubes that will perfectly fit into my input mapping. To have a look at that, let's hide our cloner object, and I will just show my empty right here quickly. I'll switch to this view. So you can see here that these are perfect squares, and these squares actually consist of smaller squares, which is this kind of 3x3 grid, and these right here are also the same size. So I know that this whole template has a height of 30 squares and a width of 19 squares. And so I can now recreate this grid and then start animating those instances of the cubes basically. And to do that, I'm gonna hop into geometry nodes again, and let's have a look at this. So I'm just gonna disable my reference image right here, and I'm gonna create a new cube, go into the geometry nodes viewer, and then I'm gonna create a new geometry node setup, select my geometry and delete it with the X key because I don't need this cube. I need actually a cube that is inside of the geometry node, so it's procedural. To create a new cube, I will press Shift A and S to search and search for a cube. Now this cube I want to instance on a grid, so I'm also gonna insert a grid right here. And then to instance it, I'm gonna look for the instance on points node. So I'm gonna drag my grid into the points and my cube into the instance node, and then my instances into the final output. So I'm gonna leave my cube size at 1 meter. And for my grid, I know that I wanna have 19 vertices on my x-axis and 30 on my y-axis. And then I also wanna increase the size accordingly. I realized when I make this 19 and 30 meters, it creates a small gap in between. And I think that's because I have kind of like an offset of 1. So I just need to decrease this by 1 for each. And now it will be perfect. And so now I can start aligning this to my camera again. So if I go into my camera view, I see that I'm just way too much into these squares. And actually, let's go back. I'm also going to rename this now to my cloner cubes. And I also want to decrease the Z value of the cubes to something like 0.1, just to have to not have them be cubes, but to have them be those flat squares again, basically. So now I can head into my camera, go to my Z position and scroll out. I'm just going to go back into my layout view just to see this better. and zoom out here and see how I can match this. So if I zoom in right here to the corner, I can really fine tune this. And this looks very good. So yeah, now we have our new set of instanced cubes. And we can start playing around with this in the same way that we did with the other ones. And now we can create similar things as before, just with these instances. And this time maybe let's translate the Z position of the cubes. So to do that, I'm gonna look for a translate instances. And then again, do my little noise setup. And now for my animated noise, I just want to save some time. So I'm just going to copy it from my previous project. So I'm just going to hop into the cloner right here, the geometry nodes we created before. And everything here from the two noise textures up to the combine XYZ, I'm just going to select. And I'm actually going to create a group from that. So just press Command G to create a new node group. And by clicking the Shift key, I can jump in and out of the node group. So now when I'm out of the node group, I can select it and then just copy it and go into my cloner cubes again and then paste it in here. And this way we can now export this to the translation. And you can see that we have the same thing going on now, just with the Z translation. Well, actually, no, it's not the Z translation. If I go inside here, I can see that it's the Y translation. Now, you could leave it like that. It's also an interesting effect, but I wanna do it on the Z axis. So I'm just gonna change that here. And so now you can see that we have these cubes kind of coming out of the whole thing. And this is quite neat. If I go into the render view, again, you can see that we have no material on here. So once again, I'm just gonna look for the set material node, put this on here and select my white material. And we also have our light, which is too small and too... Let's make our light stronger so we can see that again. Because we're working on such a different scale now, it kind of changed the whole thing. Also be sure to save the projects in between. So that's what this looks like, and this is already pretty interesting. Now, you can also play around with animating the light, all of this fun stuff. So now you can also see that if I jump in between my top view right here, that is perfectly parallel perspective. This would actually be like the completely correct perspective if you don't want any of the cubes moving on to the other slices. So you can also play around with that. So either you change the camera to a, I'm not sure if you can change that in Blender though, to a orthographic camera, and then play around with this zoom right here. But that way you also lose some of this perspective that we are getting from a perspective camera. So you can see that they are actually, going out of the frame. We might want to make the light even stronger, set to something like 2000 or even 5000. Is that too much? I mean, it's a nice strong contrast, so I think that's quite cool. Let's also play with the Z position. You can see that if it's too far down, we're losing the shadows because it's already kind of inside of the object. So you kind of want to find the sweet spot here. If I'm moving too much away, the shadows get very flat. So something like this can be interesting. So I think that's my second loop that I want to render, and I'm just going to render this out now. So now let's have a look at how these actually look like on our mapping. So the first one looks like this, where we have the rotating slices that open up, and that looks very nice. And it also works great as an overlay. So I can put this on the second layer, add in a tunnel lines effect, for example, or any source basically that is just running below it. I can increase the line width to see this better. Now I can see that there's actually this layer running behind the whole thing. And we also have the Z-translate clip, which works nicely. This is this kind of pixel grid that works very nicely with the RGB delay effect. So, even very simple stuff, it doesn't even have to be shaded. I'm just using cubes here that are switching between a full white and full black cube. But just because it aligns very well with the surface, it just works very nicely. Same with this one. Then I have this kind of Mograph effect with this sphere going upwards, rotating the tiles, and more tiles rotation effects. I think these are very effective on setups like this one. Especially this one, where it acts like a whole kind of texture. And then I also have another variation of the Z translation, where I did a bevel on the cube, and that really adds some nice texture and depth to the whole thing. And all of these clips are included in the preset pack that you can get on my web store. So that's how you can create some content for this paper mapping setup. And I hope that you got some inspiration from this, not only to recreate this step by step, but also to apply this to like your own ideas and your own project. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, leave a like and subscribe if you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.